Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Christine Muir. I am the community librarian at Cary Library. Thank you for joining us. All of the programming at Cary Library is sponsored by the donors to the Cary Library Foundation. So we like to express our gratitude and appreciation for that at every program. I have turned on the live transcript or subtitles. If you find that distracting, you can click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and hide subtitles. But we do have an audience that finds those helpful. So I do try to enable those when I remember. I am also recording tonight's program, but you should see that Mary Alice and I are the primary screens on your computer. That's what will be captured in the recording. So don't worry about having your camera on or participating in this. It'll just be the two of us on screen. We are using breakout rooms tonight, but those will not be recorded. So don't hold back at all in the breakout rooms. Know that there's a lot of safe space to have the conversation there. And at any point tonight, you are welcome to use the chat feature to ask questions of myself or our speaker. We will have a Q&A period probably at 2 points during the evening where our featured speaker will answer questions from all of you. So our plan for tonight, this is a little bit different than our straightforward lecture series. We will have our author speak for about 20 minutes on her book, which gives a really positive spin to affecting change. And then we will ask you about the topics that you're interested in discussing in a deeper level or discussing further. So we'll do a poll for that and I'll talk you through it when we get to it. Then we'll do some Q&A with our author. So we just want to get a sense of your interest so that I can create the breakout rooms while we're doing some Q&A with Mary Alice. We'll spend about 15 minutes in those breakout rooms, and we do have a facilitator joining each room that will help guide the conversation. And after the breakout rooms, we'll all come back to this main room where we'll just kind of recap what happened in those small group discussions. And if you have further questions for Mary Alice, those can be addressed at the end of the program as well. And again, if you have any questions at any point, please don't hesitate to use the chat. So with all of that, I'm very excited to turn this over to Mary Alice Haddad. Mary Alice is the John E. Andrus Professor of Government and Chair of the College of East Asian Studies and Professor of Environmental Studies at Wesleyan University. Thank you, Mary Alice, for letting me use a condensed biography since I had so many instructions in there. And also thank you for being here tonight. I will turn things over to you now.
Thanks so much, Christine. It's really fun for me to be on this side of a Cary Library program. I have been in the audience often and really enjoy the programming that Cary puts on. And I also want to thank all of you that have shown up. I know this has been an insane year and everybody's very tired of COVID and we're all tired of Zoom and it's a beautiful night outside. So I'm actually shocked that we have an audience of more than about 2 to come to this talk. So I'm really appreciative of your time and thanks for coming. I'm going to start off sharing my screen. Hopefully this works. I have some PowerPoint slides. And here we go. So I'm talking tonight about a book that I just published with MIT Press about environmental advocacy in East Asia. And I started this project. I'm a specialist in East Asian politics, and I do a lot of work on grassroots community organizing and activities. My last book had been on democracy in Japan. And I noticed this puzzling outcome in East Asia, which was that East Asia is a political environment that's very hostile to advocacy. Political lobbying is illegal in several of the countries, and in all of the countries, the governments are generally run by pro-business governments, whatever the political party that's in charge. And yet the region had a lot of very pro-environmental policies. So this seemed to me that advocates that were operating in East Asia were in a difficult environment, but they were actually getting some stuff done. So I wanted to find out, what is it that they're doing that works? And maybe we can learn something about that. So I looked at 4 countries in East Asia, thinking that I would find that democracy was a key important feature in what was effective. What I expected to find was that in Japan, there would be sort of a wide range of things that people did that were effective. And that in South Korea and Taiwan, which have become democracies more recently, there would be a somewhat more narrower range of things that advocates could do that would work. And in China, which is not a democracy, that there would be a very narrow range of stuff that would work. And a lot of advocacy strategies would not be available. And so I designed the study looking at the 4 countries to try to figure out what was effective and how and why democracy mattered. I was also interested in testing whether East Asia was sort of different, because there's a lot of literature in East Asia that's sort of Confucian culture, and things are very different in East Asia. And so whatever was effective in East Asia might not actually be effective elsewhere. So I went in to test those things. So the first thing that I did was to go into the 4 countries and talk to a lot of people. I talked to environmental advocates, I talked to business leaders, I talked to grassroots volunteers, I talked to government folks at the local level and the national level. And I was actually shocked by what I found. What I found was the same set of things worked everywhere. It didn't matter whether you were in Japan or China or Korea, the same kinds of strategies worked. These were the 5 things that people mentioned over and over again in my interviews. And it didn't matter what country you were in or who you were, you would often mention 3 of the 5. The first one was make and empower friends on the inside. Those of you that are involved in political advocacy will not be shocked to hear that if you are an environmental NGO and you hire the former Minister of the Environment to be on the board of directors of your NGO, that's a good idea. That is an effective strategy, whether you're in Berlin or DC or Bonn or Tokyo, it doesn't matter. That works really well. Another strategy that was really effective was to make it work locally, where you get a good idea, you implement it in one place, and you get it to actually work there. Once you've gotten it to work in one community, you can mimic that in another community and another community and another community. And you get enough communities to copy that and get it to work, then it becomes regional policy or national policy and can even spread internationally. Another strategy that was very effective in environmental advocacy is if you could find that sweet spot where your pro-environmental policy also makes money. That works pretty well, no matter where you are. Education was critical, both at the grassroots level and among elites, sort of getting out important information about environment, climate change, pollution, and what kind of behaviors improve things. And then somewhat surprisingly, art showed up very consistently as an important way to help people care. As one of the artists that I interviewed phrased it, they said, you can fill people's head with numbers, and you can tell them it's very important, and you can show the science behind it, and you can engage their brain that way with the numbers and the science, but you can't make them care. But with art, through a variety of different ways, you can engage their heart, and you can make it matter, their environmental behaviors. And then finally, there was sort of this catch-all category where in all the places that I studied, there were specific individuals that were so innovative that they just changed the game for everybody else. They sort of often used a combination of these things, sometimes used things that were completely different, but essentially their actions actually shifted the entire landscape. And so in my book, I look at all of these. I have chapters on each one of them, except education. And that's because there's actually a lot of research on education already. So I didn't feel that there was a lot of value added. So tonight I wanted to show you, just start off with a few statistics and then tell you a couple of my favorite stories that are coming out from the project. Actually, maybe I'll keep questions for Q&A since it keeps it a little easier. So this is a statistical study looking at news sources. So I looked at, I used Factiva news sources, and I chose cases that happened between 2005 and 2009. And I chose that time frame because it was recent enough that it could feel like it was contemporary issues, but it was old enough that most of the cases that were in the data set had been resolved. So the advocates that were advocating for whatever it is they wanted, they either got it or they didn't get it. So I was able to code whether the advocacy was a success or a failure at the end of it. In some cases you couldn't tell, but most cases, 95%, I was able to code as either a success or a failure. And I coded lots of different things. So this was my attempt to figure out, of the strategies that I was studying, which were the most effective, which were the most common, and where were they effective and common. And you can see this is how frequently the strategies showed up in the newspaper articles. And what I'd like you to notice here is that the strategies that I mentioned that came out of my interviews were in fact the most common strategies, not just in East Asia, but everywhere in the world. Sort of getting an environmental idea to work in a specific local place and then scaling that to other communities. That was a really effective strategy. Likewise, finding allies in the government, working for business, etc. The other thing that I'd like to note here is that the different color bars are the different places in the world, and East Asia does not stand out as particularly strange in any way. These bars go up and down in relative concert with one another. So the strategies that are effective in East Asia are in fact effective everywhere. So I'll start off with one of my favorite stories, which is this Kita Kyushu, and is a medium-sized city. It's got about 1 million people in the southern part of Japan. And it has a sister city called Surabaya, which is a small for Indonesia, but it's about 2 million people. And they're sister cities. And so in the late early 2000s, Surabaya reached out to Kita Kyushu. Kita Kyushu used to be a heavily polluted industrial city. You can think from American lore, you can think Pittsburgh. So Kita Kyushu was like the Pittsburgh of Japan. So really polluted, very polluted water, lots and lots of industry. And it went through a shift starting in the 90s, and now sort of markets itself as a rejuvenated city and a green city with lots of green technology in the city. And so Surabaya noticed that its landfills were filling up so fast that they were going to run out of space completely in like 5 years. So they reached out to Kita Kyushu and they said, can you help us out? We need to figure out how to get our landfills to fill up more slowly, how to manage our municipal waste. So IGIS, the little NGO in the middle, is a Japanese NGO, sent some folks down to Kita Kyushu to kind of study the problem, and they realized that one of the main issues was food waste. And they also identified in the city, those of you that have traveled internationally will recognize the scene on the left. It's very common in poor countries where you have an abandoned lot and people just dump their trash there. And so that was all over Kita Kyushu, all over Surabaya. They had this problem, which is a public health nightmare, as you can say, not to mention aesthetically unattractive. And they also had this problem with the landfills were filling up. So this trash that you see on the left, it didn't even make it to the landfill. And then the landfills were also filling up. So Kita Kyushu, through IGIS, commissioned a study to try to find out if they could figure out a better way to compost food waste. And they came up with a new system that composts food waste much faster. So Surabaya then reached out to local NGO that was run by women, trained them all how to use this composting method, distributed these composting buckets locally to some of the communities. And then you could see a positive cycle where you, the household, would get your composting bucket for free. You would fill it up with your food waste, thereby keeping that food waste out of the municipal landfill. The food waste would compost. You could then use the compost in your home garden, or you can bring the compost back to the NGO, and the NGO would buy it from you. Not very much, like a pound, a penny a pound or something. So it didn't generate very much money, but it did generate enough money so that it incentivized the people to do it, and it generated enough money to run the operations of the center. And in the end, what you saw was people would bring the compost in, and that compost that was brought in was used for green space in the city. So you can see what happened to the empty lot that was on the left turned into a local park on the right, which is one of the places where they use the compost and also one of the places where they collect the compost. Okay, so now we have our local solution, got the good idea, we got it working in the town, first in the neighborhood and then in the city. So now we're trying to scale it. So this is a great idea. We should try to get some other people to disseminate. So Aegis holds several different workshops where they brought in municipal leaders, and these were not usually the mayor. It was usually the person under the mayor. So it's the person who's in charge of the municipal waste in the town. First from a network of 11 Southeast Asian countries. And then, as you can see from the map below, a global network of communities that they sent people out to train them in this composting method. They trained up they worked with a local volunteer organization to do the dissemination of the buckets and the collection of the compost. And then this method moved out to all these cities. So you can see that this is one of my favorite methods of the sort of make it work locally. Something super small, as basic as composting food waste, actually got disseminated to, I think it's 31 different cities around the world, and dramatically reduced the landfill. So the amount of solid waste that was being put in to Surabaya's municipal waste dump was reduced by 30%. And I can't remember the metric tons of CO2 that was saved by this, but it was just gigantic. So the amount of benefit to this for the communities at large was very large, even though it was very small. It started off just in a neighborhood. So the other set of examples that I wanted to share with you come from the art. This was my favorite chapter to write, I have to say. I had so much fun talking to the artists. So I'm just going to highlight two examples of the way that art was able to be used effectively as an advocacy tool in raising awareness and other things. So this is it's called the Green Pedestrian Crossing in China. If you Google after the session, if you Google Green Pedestrian Crossing in China on YouTube, you can actually see a video of the people doing the green pedestrian. So the artist laid out this giant white canvas over a crosswalk. And on the two sides of the crosswalk, they had little blotters with eco-friendly green ink. And they started with 7 crosswalks in Shanghai, and then that worked really well. So then they moved to 132 crosswalks in 15 cities. In the end, they estimated 4 million people passed over these things, and awareness of the importance of walking and not driving related to climate change and especially smog rose by 86% over the period that this eco art installation was in place. So you can see that it starts off with this tree that has no leaves on it. And then as people walk across with their feet, they put visually leaves onto the tree. And in the end, you can see the image on the right, you end up with a tree that has lots of leaves. So you have the connotation between my walking to work, walking to school can help generate greenery and save and save the planet. So the second example that I use also has to do with putting leaves on a tree. This one is from Seoul, and it's called the Street Campaign. The T is big, you can see, so you get the tree. The tree is bigger. It was developed by a startup organization called Tree Planet, which is featured both in the eco art through this installation and one more in the book, and also in my Game Changer, because they actually come up with a video game that plants trees. So in this art installation, the principle of it was somewhat similar, but the motivation was different. So in Seoul, there's a famous tree called Gasu-gil Street. So it literally means tree-lined street in Seoul. And because they were doing the big major redevelopment, they were knocking down all the trees. So tree-lined street was not going to have any trees anymore. And so one of the things that art can do is that can make things that don't exist. It can make the invisible visible to people. So these trees are gone. There's no tree there anymore. And so what the advocates wanted to do was to bring the trees back. So they put up the big canvas with the tree on it. And actually the canvas is real, but the tree is projected. And as you come up to the installation, there's a QR code. So you scan the QR code, and on your phone, you're generated two things. One, you can donate to help plant trees, and you can sign this petition. So you sign your petition, and they use an algorithm to turn your petition into a leaf. And then the leaf gets projected onto the tree. So you can see over on the right-hand side, the sort of what it looks like at night, where the projection's coming from across the street. So in the end, similar with what happened in Shanghai, the leaves proliferated and they generated actually more than twice as many. They needed 4,000 signatures to get the trees planted, but they ended up with more than twice the number that they needed. The final art piece, the giant tree, ended up selling for $45,000, and they raised additional money with the signatures. And they were able to line not just one street that had been intended, but actually two entire streets so planted new trees where they weren't. So this was a way where the art engaged people in ways that would not have been possible. It just, the newspaper telling you that trees are disappearing. So those were my 2 or 3 examples I wanted to share with you this evening. And I want to make sure that we leave enough time for Q&A, because I'm hoping that, unlike many talks, that the gathering today is actually an interactive conversation among neighbors and not just you sitting back and listening to me. So for the Q&A, we'll do 10-15 minutes of Q&A before breaking into the breakout rooms. And I will turn it over to Christine for that part, or to explain the next section.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do, you can start entering any questions that you have for Mary Alice in the chat. I am going to launch a poll. We've identified 9 areas in which we think you may be interested in having a conversation about how you can use the information that Mary Alice just presented and apply it to Lexington specifically. I'm going to launch this poll. You can choose one of the topics, because we'll only open up the rooms where there are people who are interested in having a discussion. But keep in mind, if you try to think of a second topic that would also be interesting to you, in case you're the only person who wants to talk about one topic. Maybe there's another group that you'd be willing to join where you could meet with more than one person. This is an anonymous poll. I can tell how many people have voted, so I am just going to leave it up for a little bit to allow some participation. There are 9 choices, so you may need to scroll a little bit to see all 9. The last one is legislative advocacy, so if you don't see that, you need to scroll down a little bit. And all you have to do is click on the radio button next to the option. And once we have a good response on this, I will close the poll and we will open up the breakout rooms. At the moment, the most interest we have is in transportation and food waste. So if you want to have a conversation on another topic, please choose something. I don't think you all can see the results in real time. So I'm just giving you a sense of what topics are getting some interest, so that if you need to think of a secondary choice, then you have some time to do that. I will leave the poll up, and I will ask Mary Alice, there is one question in chat right now. Did all the countries you studied seem to have a similar number of grassroots organizations per capita?
That's a great question. And the answer is no. So I will begin by saying it's actually not that easy to tell how many grassroots organizations exist, because many organizations are not formally registered. In the US, there are a lot of tax incentives to register as a nonprofit organization, and the barrier to do that is really easy. But that is not true for many of these other countries. So it's a little bit hard to actually tell how many people are involved and how many organizations there are. But there are, per capita, sort of impressionistically, Japan has a ton. So it actually has more people involved in sort of grassroots neighborhood level organizations than the United States. So people in Japan, there's a very, very high level of membership in these kinds of organizations. In Korea and Taiwan, there's also a lot of people that are involved. Those two countries tend to be, especially Korea, tends to be a little bit more politicized. They have a very large organizations called KFEM, Korean Federation of Environmental Movements, which is the largest environmental organization in all of East Asia. And it is, unlike in the other countries, it's quite partisan. And so you end up with, like in the US, this sort of, it becomes a political issue, not just about green or not green. It becomes a, red or blue kind of issue in Korea. But there still are lots of people in Korea and Taiwan that are involved. In China, it's a little trickier. China is actively, in the last, especially 2-3 years, cracked down. So when I went to China in the beginning, at the end of 2010, so this is before the Arab Spring showed up, the environmental advocates that I talked to were very, very hopeful. They said things are opening up, there's lots more engagement, China's really interested in environment, they recognize civil society is important, the Olympics had just happened, so there's a lot of positive energy around that. But when the Arab Spring happened in early 2011, the Chinese government cracked down because they didn't want a Chinese spring. And then Xi Jinping came into power. And for the last, especially 2, 3, 4 years, there's been a constraining of the space of civil society in China. And so what we've been seeing in China on the environmental advocacy, which I'm happy to talk about more if people are interested, is the environmental organizations or organizations in general. There are many of them because China is big, but as on a per capita basis, there are not that many, but there's lots of apps. So there's lots of ways in which you as an individual can make your voice heard. But you as an individual can't join with other individuals to form an organization, especially an organization that's in several parts of the country, to make your voice heard. That is politically very difficult or impossible in some ways. So as an individual, they have the Chinese government has this great app as part of their national, I wish we had it in this country. It's got a great name too. It's called the Black and Smelly Waters Program. So if you're wandering around and you smell smelly water, you can stop and take a picture with your phone and upload it on your WeChat account or the couple other places where you can do it. And the government has to respond within 6 days or a week to say okay, we investigated your black and smelly water and now we're going to figure it out. So but that bypasses civil society. It goes straight from the individual to the government. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic in China.
Interesting. So I'm going to leave the poll open a little bit longer, just in case people still want to think about it. And facilitators, I'm going to give you an opportunity to vote as well, because at the moment there are 4 topics with some interest. If your topic is not yet getting any votes and you want to pick a different topic that you'd be interested in, it'll let us make sure that we have some even conversations. So the 4 that currently have interest are transportation, food, education, and climate. For those of you who maybe haven't done polls before, you can move the window. If the poll window is blocking Mary Alice's face, as it was on my screen, you can move that window off to the side so that you can see her in answering, while she's answering some questions. And I do have another question.
Or if you're tired of my face, you can move the poll to block my face.
Or the reverse also. So I did get some questions that were sent to me directly as host. I'm not sure if you see them also as co-host, but how was the, is it Capita Q? How was that disseminated internationally? Or in a different saying, which of your 5 strategies were most effective in doing that beyond making it work locally?
That's a great question. So the disseminating it internationally required several of the strategies, but especially the making friends on the inside. So the way the international dissemination worked is that the nonprofit organization IGES has connections to the Japanese government, especially their version of USAID that's called JICA. So they would call an international conference of the people that they thought in the other cities who thought they would like this composting model. So imagine if you had it in a Lexington setup, you would first have a meeting, and the first round that you would do would be to call Cambridge and Winchester and Concord and our neighboring towns, or maybe other folks in New Hampshire, or maybe you've got a friend that's down in South Carolina and your mom's in Denver and whatever. So you call a meeting of the people who are in other towns that you think might adopt this. And then you bring them to the meeting in the conference and you show how it works, and you take them on a little tour and you show how it works out in your town. And then they go home and they say, oh my gosh, I went to Lexington and learned this cool thing. And so that's how it worked in the internationally, and they were able to rope in very complex levels of funding. So as you can see, once it got started, it was self-financed, but the startup money often required government funding. And many of the government funding, much of that government funding actually came from the Japanese government through its JICA program. So they were able to match the Japanese government, the local community in Africa, say, or Latin America, would put in for a Japanese aid program to fund its composting system. And that's how it worked out.
Interesting. Another question about the slide that depicted the quantitative study. There were several additional strategies described. Could you comment on how useful those other strategies are or were in that study?
Yeah, so I didn't put a lot of time into studying the strategies that actually get the most press in the US, especially protests and lawsuits. So protests and lawsuits get a lot of press in the US, and especially after this summer, we can see lots of protests. And they generate a lot of noise, but I was curious about how effective they are. And in terms of how often you use them and how often you win, they aren't very effective. And I kind of dismissed them. It was like, protests are really people being really mad, and they're just like expressing their, emotions. But unless you have lots and they sustain a long time, that it doesn't really work. But actually, a woman, Barbara Finnemore, who sort of headed up Natural Resource Defense Council in China for like decades, who's a lawyer, she made me think about it really differently. She helped me see that those more confrontational strategies that are on the lower success and lower frequency end of the spectrum, it's better to think about them kind of like venture capital, where if you invest $100 in 100 different companies, you're going to lose 90% of them, you're going to lose money. But in 10, you're going to make so much money that you actually make up for the loss in the 90%. And so in what I've seen, the protests and the lawsuits have less effect in terms of I'm protesting against a thing and I'm going to get the thing that I'm protesting. And similar with the laws, most lawsuits fail, but both of those work to raise the profile of the issue. They both raise interest of the issue. They gather attention. They gather policymaking attention. And every so often, one of them breaks through. And when that happens, it can be a game changer for everybody. So if you can get an environmental lawsuit in particular, now it's not just the company that you sued that has to pay, but all the companies that are like the company that you sued also have to pay. And so the win can be really big.
I have two more questions in chat, and I think we have about 5 more minutes here before we go into our conversations. So the first of the last two is, what were the conclusions of your study, particularly around the impact of democracy?
That's a great question. So as I mentioned, I was really surprised that democracy didn't seem to really matter in terms of what strategies were effective. The place where democracy matters is what happens when you fail. So if you're in Japan and you're advocating to like, don't build this stinky polluting thing in my town, and you fail, you just go home out, you go out with your friends and you have a beer, and then you like go fight the next day, right? And if you're in South Korea and Taiwan, you go and you fight, and then you go home and you have a beer, and you might get blacklisted by the government. So if you're an academic, you might not have access to government grants. There might be some, like, you're basically fine. You basically can go home and have a beer and, moan and go on to fight the next day. If you're China and you fail, bad things can happen to you. You can vanish. You can be detained for long periods of time. You can be harassed. So I didn't study failure. I was interested in success, but it is clearly the case that the strategies that lead to success, it's a different dynamic than the things that lead to failure and what happens when you fail. And someone should go and study failure and see what that does for how democracy impacts what advocates can do when they fail.
It is interesting that democracy didn't have as much of an impact as you thought it would. But I think that that's actually maybe a positive thing, because it shows that there's a lot of different ways to advocate for an issue you believe in. So I think that may be a positive. So this next question is a nice segue into our breakout rooms. So just an update on where we are with our topics. There are 4 topics that are definitely topping people's list of interest: transportation, food, education, and climate. So I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm going to close the polls and just open up those 4 breakout rooms. And when I open those up, I'll go through the instructions for everybody on how you can join a room. So this question is, if you were to choose a solution from your book that would be effective and executable for Lexington, what would you pick?
So that's a great question. And I think the book is organized around these strategies, and oftentimes combining strategies makes them more effective. And so often, in general, I would think about Lexington as a local place. So I would use one of the make it work locally strategies, and then maybe combine it with one of the others. So make it work locally and make it a green business strategy, and then scale that. Or make it work locally and have an eco art installation in Lexington that then can reach some other people. Or make it work locally, and so having having it work locally with one of the other strategies, and then getting that effective solution worked out in Lexington and then scaling it. And Lexington already does a lot of things. And so I think there's a lot of potential. There are a lot of things that are already working in Lexington. And so now the challenge is to take those things that are working in Lexington and get them to other places.
Yeah, and I also think that this is an opportunity to sort of start thinking outside the box. I loved the art examples in showing how it can raise awareness for people who may not have thought about it before, or it gives them a different way of looking at it. So I definitely think there are lots of conversations going on in Lexington, lots of participation and interest. And I think that tonight could be a good example of how to think outside the box and look at other ways to broaden that conversation or broaden the participation in that conversation. So that's a lovely segue. Thank you to the person who asked that question, because I think that's a nice way to move into our breakout rooms. So I'm going to end the poll, and I will share the results with you just so that you can see what they are and know what the breakout rooms are that we'll have, but also see the experience of seeing poll results in case that hasn't happened to you in a Zoom session before. So you'll learn a technical skill tonight as well. So I'm going to stop sharing that now so that I can do the piece I need to do for the breakout rooms. And I will, like I said, explain how these will work. So give me 1 second.